I found this desk on the side of the road. Somebody had put it out with a free sign on it, so I took it home to be refinished. Most of the desk is solid oak, with the exception of one plywood panel in the back and the top, which is plywood with a plastic laminate on it. My plan was to ebonize it using a solution of vinegar and steel wool. I'd never done it before, but I decided to give it a try. I began by removing the old finish, and to do this I used a paint scraper. Once I had the finish off, I gave it a light sanding. And I'm sure people are going to ask why I didn't just sand it from the beginning instead of scraping it to remove the finish. I prefer to use the scraper to remove the finish rather than sanding it because I feel that it's less likely to do damage with the scraper than it is with the sander. And also, if I use a sander, then I have the added expense of sandpaper. I noticed that somebody had driven nails into the spindle joints on the desk. And I'm sure this is probably because the joints had loosened up over time, but even with the nails in there, they were still loose. So I wanted to re-glue those joints, but first I'd have to remove the nails. The first two came out relatively easily. But the last one was buried pretty deep and I wasn't able to get it out. So I decided just to remove the whole leg assembly and see if I could wiggle it out once the whole thing was disassembled. And then I'd be able to re-glue the leg assembly as well, since that was loose also. First, I had to remove a few screws. And after a few taps with the mallet, the legs came off. And then I could try to get that nail out again. And with the leg assembly off the rest of the desk, I was able to pull the spindle out a little bit and get better access to the nail. This spindle that was between the legs wouldn't come out without taking the upper leg joint apart. But that was still pretty solid, so I didn't want to force that apart. So to get glue into the spindle joints without taking the leg joints apart, I used a glue syringe, which I could insert into the holes where the nails were and shoot some glue in through there. And I started by putting it together without any glue, just to make sure I had everything lined up correctly. And then I took it apart and applied the glue. If you enjoy watching my videos, please consider joining my Patreon. Patreon is a way that you can help support what I do while gaining access to exclusive videos and updates that aren't available on my YouTube channel. I'll put a link in the video description if you'd like to check it out. Thanks. Next, it was time to attempt to ebonize the finish. And basically, I was just trying to turn it black, or as close to black as I could get. I made this solution by taking a bottle of white vinegar and one steel wool pad and stuffing the steel wool pad into the vinegar. And I let it sit for about 3 or 4 days. And I believe the idea is that the vinegar solution is supposed to react with the tannins in the oak and turn it black, or at least turn it dark. So I poured some of the vinegar into a cup through a coffee filter just to be sure to catch any steel wool particles that might be in there. And then I wiped it on the wood. I was a little disappointed at first because it didn't seem to be changing the color of the wood very much. But after I let it sit for about 20 minutes, it turned a nice grayish silver color. So not quite black, but I liked the way it looked. So I proceeded to wipe it on the entire desk. And it did seem to get darker the more applications I put on. But after about the 4th or 5th application, it seemed like it wasn't getting darker anymore, so I stopped there. The top of the desk is plywood, so the edge of the desktop, where the plywood edge is exposed, didn't react to the vinegar solution. So for this part, I just painted it black. Once the desk was dry, it was time to add the top coat. And first I very lightly sanded it with a soft sanding pad. It didn't say what grit it was, but it felt like maybe 320 or 400. And for the top coat, I'm using a water-based polyurethane, which I don't usually use. I usually use an oil-based polyurethane because I like the color that it adds, and it's also really easy to use. But in this case, the color of the desk was just about perfect as it was, so I wanted to use something that didn't add color to it. And water-based polyurethanes generally don't add any color. They're pretty clear. And I applied 2 coats. And here it is, all finished. Well, maybe not completely finished. I still needed to make a couple of drawer pulls, and the top of it was still a plastic laminate. I hadn't done anything with that. At this point, I had kind of run out of steam with this project, and I left the desk as it is for about 2 years. And then I finally came back to it and made a couple of drawer pulls for it and put some new wood veneer on the top. And this is how I did it. The first thing I did was to glue this piece of veneer to the laminate top. I found a big roll of this veneer at a thrift store for a pretty cheap price. I'm not positive, but I think it's white oak. And it's a paper-backed veneer, but I'm not sure what the thickness is. One thing that can be an issue sometimes with veneer is it can be a little bit rippled or bumpy. You can kind of see here where there are some raised portions of the veneer. So you have to be really careful to get those parts glued down. I think there's even some kind of a veneer flattener that you can get that you apply to the veneer to flatten it out. I've never tried that, but it may be worth a try. Before I glued the veneer on, I sanded down the top to get rid of the gloss, just to help the glue to adhere easier. And I did this with 80 grit sandpaper. And then I vacuumed it off. And wiped it down with some naphtha. There may be better ways to do this than what I'm showing in this video, but this technique has worked for me on a few pieces, so I'll just show how I did it. And then I applied some contact cement, and you have to apply the cement to both surfaces because it will only stick to itself. I applied 2 coats to the veneer since that's an absorbative surface, so it may absorb some of the first application of glue that you put on. So once that's dry, I just put another coat over that, and I put a coat of glue on the top. And then you're supposed to wait for it to dry a little bit. And before I laid the veneer over the top, I put some dowels on the desktop just to keep the veneer and the desktop from touching until I'm ready for them to touch. Because the way contact cement works, once the 2 surfaces touch, they're not going to come apart again. So having the dowels there gives you a chance to get the veneer aligned properly before sticking it to the top. And then I took the dowels out one by one and pressed the 2 surfaces together. And I used my fingers and also the end of this chisel to really focus on getting all of those ripples pushed down and stuck to the desktop. And then I went over the top with a piece of wood with one edge rounded off. And I'm sure I'll get lots of comments from people saying I should be using a J roller for this. And I'm sure that would also work. But I got this technique from a veneer manufacturer that recommended this instead of a J roller. And since I don't have a J roller, but I have plenty of scrap wood lying around, I've been using this technique. And it's worked well for me. and you want to make sure you apply plenty of pressure to get those two surfaces stuck together. Once the veneer was glued down, then I had to remove the excess around the edges. And I used a router with a flush cutting bit on it. This is a bit that has a bearing that rides along the edge, so it just follows the edge and cuts the veneer flush with the side of the desktop. Or at least that's what it's supposed to do. In this case, the edge of the desktop was curved, so the bearing was riding along the high edge of the curve, so the blade couldn't reach all the way to the edge of the top. So there was just a little bit of veneer left over, sticking over the edge. So to take care of that, I took a utility knife blade and just carefully trimmed the excess off. And then I sanded the edge smooth. The next thing I did was to wet down the surface with water. I did this because I knew I was going to be applying some vinegar and steel wool later on to turn it black. And putting vinegar on that could possibly raise the grain of the wood, and then I'd have to sand it. And I don't know how far down the black color goes, so I didn't want to end up sanding through the black. So by first putting water on the veneer, the water will raise the grain, which I can then sand smooth. And then when I put the vinegar on, hopefully that won't raise the grain very much, since I already did that with the water. And then I just let the top sit for a few days to give the glue plenty of time to set. And in the meantime, I moved on to making some drawer pulls. I made the drawer pulls from an old piece of tongue and groove oak flooring. First thing I did was to cut off the tongue and the groove. And then just made a series of cuts to get the piece down to the size that I wanted. Then I angled the blade a little bit to put a little bit of a taper on it. And then cut them to length. The drawers already had screw holes drilled in them from the original pulls, which were gone when I got the desk. So I used those holes to get the overall length of the pull. Only 2 of the drawers needed pulls. The others you could open by just grabbing underneath the front of the drawer. Then I could drill the screw holes on a drill press. And I rounded off the ends using a belt sander. And then I could apply the vinegar and steel wool mixture to the top and the drawer pulls. But before I applied the vinegar, I first went over the veneer on the top with a wire brush to clean out the pores of the wood. This oak had some pretty deep pores, and I really wanted them to stand out when it was finished. I wanted them to be visible. So I cleaned them out as best I could with the brush. And then I could apply the vinegar. I made it by putting a pad of steel wool into a bottle of vinegar and letting it dissolve. And when it's applied to a wood like oak, it reacts with the tannin in the wood and turns it black. Although it doesn't turn it completely black, which is nice, it actually gives it a very natural look. And there's some variation in the color, and there may be some light streaks and dark streaks, but not a blotchy look, just kind of a very natural look to it. The edge of the desktop was a little bit beat up, so I went over that with some black wood filler to try to fill in some of those divots and make it a little smoother looking. Before I applied the top coat, I first wiped down the top and the pulls with some naphtha, and I did this just to clean off any excess black stuff that was on there. And it did take some off the surface. It just seemed like a good idea to remove anything loose, and it didn't seem to affect the overall color of the desk. And I didn't have to use naphtha for this. I just used it because it was the closest thing at hand. I could have used anything that wouldn't raise the grain. This just happened to be nearby. Once the vinegar was dry, then I applied a top coat of satin clear lacquer to the top and the drawer pulls. After I applied a few coats of lacquer and let it dry, I gave it a light sanding with this fine sanding pad. It doesn't have a grit number on it, but it feels like it's probably around 320. Just gently to get off any rough spots in the lacquer. And then I applied a few more coats. The last thing to do was to screw on the drawer pulls. And here it is. Thanks for watching.